There was a day when the most radiant of all the gods walked a dusty road behind another man's cattle. The hands that once drew a golden bow now held a plain shepherd's staff. The voice that froze the hearts of prophetesses fell silent, because now the one giving orders was another, an ordinary mortal king. The god of light, music, and prophecy, the one before whom the whole known world bowed, found himself enslaved to a human being. And he could neither escape nor take revenge, because his own father had passed that sentence. Apollo, the pride of Olympus, lived a full year as a slave, herding flocks like the lowest hired hand in a stranger's house. What had he done that even the gods refused to forgive? This story begins not with chains, but with a father's love for his son, because everything that followed grew out of one simple attempt to save someone you love from death. Ask yourself whether you have ever paid a high price for somebody else's pride. Whether someone far stronger than you has ever decided your fate without asking for your consent. Whether you have ever wondered where the line runs that must not be crossed, even when the heart screams the opposite. That is exactly what the story of Apollo the slave is about how the highest power fell the lowest, about how an attempt to defeat death turned into somebody else's destruction, and about why even an immortal had to bow his head and endure disgrace in silence. To understand the full depth of his fall, we first have to see the height he fell from. Apollo was no minor deity remembered only in a few scattered regions. He stood at the very heart of the Greek world, beside his father Zeus, and his shadow lay across the life of every human being from birth to death. This was a god whose name people spoke with love and fear at the same time. He was born a twin, together with his sister Artemis. Their mother, gentle Leto, carried within her the children of the mightiest of the gods, and that alone made her the target of savage persecution. But we will return to those hardships later, because a mother's love plays an important part in our story. For now, it is enough to know that Apollo came into the world as the son of the Thunderer, as the heir to a share of heavenly power. The Greeks saw in him, above all, the bearer of light and purity. He drove away darkness, scattered ignorance, and granted clarity of mind. They compared him to the sun rising over the earth and chasing away the terrors of the night. Wherever Apollo appeared, sickness, madness, and defilement retreated. People believed he could cleanse even the man who had stained himself with spilled blood, and it was to him that those seeking forgiveness for grave deeds would turn. He was the god of music, and this was no mere entertainment for gods at their banquets. In the ancient understanding, music meant order, harmony, the structure of the world itself. When Apollo touched the strings of his lyre, even the fiercest quarrels on Olympus fell silent, and the sky itself seemed to steady its breathing. His art was the highest expression of measure, of that graceful order that stands against wild chaos. He was also the god of prophecy, and that meant a power no mortal ruler could match. Through his sanctuary at Delphi, people learned the will of fate. Kings began and ended wars, founded new cities, and chose their heirs, listening to the words that flowed from his temple. Whoever holds prophecy quietly holds the decisions of an entire world in his hands, and that power belonged to Apollo. And he was an archer whose hand never missed. His golden bow granted not only protection, but sudden death. The Greeks believed that a man's unexpected passing, especially a swift and painless one, was the work of Apollo's arrow. The same god who healed and gave health could, by the same will, send a plague that emptied entire camps. Two sides of one power were joined in him, because whoever holds authority over illness holds authority over healing as well. Now put all these traits together. Radiant, forever young, beautiful, gifted with music, prophecy, healing, and a deadly arrow. A god before whom nations trembled and other deities bowed. A being who stood as high as it is possible to stand, yielding only to Zeus himself. And it is this very being that our story will show, broken, humiliated, stripped of power, silently serving a mortal king. How could such a thing even happen? How could a force that governed destinies be forced to its knees? The Greeks who composed these tales were not afraid to show their gods as vulnerable. Their deities were not flawless and unreachable. They loved, raged, erred, and suffered like people, only on an immeasurably greater scale. And that is exactly why the story of Apollo's humiliation sounded to an ancient listener not like blasphemy, but like a deep truth about the nature of any power. Because this tale carries the idea that even the highest authority has a limit, that above the gods stands something higher still, a certain law of the world order that cannot be broken without consequence. And when Apollo broke that law, even his divine origin did not save him from the reckoning. The punishment awaited him not for weakness, but on the contrary, for an excess of love and pride. It all began long before the servitude, with one woman and one son, with a story of love that ended in betrayal, fire, and a miraculous rescue. Because before he became a slave, Apollo became a father, and it was his child who set in motion the chain of events that brought the radiant god to shameful bondage. To understand why he took up a shepherd's staff, we first have to learn whom he lost. There once lived in the land of Thessaly a family that traced its line back to ancient rulers, and there was a girl there named Coronis, a king's daughter, famous throughout the region for her beauty. It was on her that Apollo's gaze fell, and the god burned for this mortal woman with a love that is rare even among immortals. He chose her above all others, and she answered him in kind, and soon a new life stirred beneath her heart. But Apollo, for all his power, could not always be at her side. Divine matters called him away, and he had to leave his beloved alone. So as not to lose sight of her, he set a guardian over her, a white raven, a bird that in those distant days, so the story goes, wore dazzling white feathers. The raven watched the girl and was to report to the god everything that happened in her house. And it came to pass that Coronis turned her heart to another. While the god was far away, she fell in love with a mortal youth and agreed to become his wife. Perhaps she was frightened by what it means to love an immortal who will never grow old, while she herself would wither and die. Perhaps she longed for a simple human life beside someone who would be with her every day. One way or another, she broke her promise to the god. The white raven saw everything and rushed across the sky to inform his master. He brought Apollo the news of the betrayal, surely hoping for a reward for his faithful service. But the opposite happened. Hearing the terrible news, the god blazed with such rage that his fury alone scorched the bird. The raven's white feathers turned black in that fire, and ever since, as the Greeks told it, all ravens wear black in memory of the evil tidings their ancestor carried. So the messenger received eternal disgrace for telling the truth. Grief and pain blinded even the radiant god. In a surge of jealousy and despair, he could not hold himself back. The arrow of punishment, according to the ancient accounts, was loosed by his sister Artemis, defending her brother's honor, and struck by it, Coronis fell dead. Only when life had already faded from his beloved did clarity return to Apollo, and with it came unbearable remorse. He understood what he had done, but not even he could undo it. By custom, the body of Coronis was laid on a high funeral pyre. The flames rose, and the fire began to devour the woman the god had loved so fiercely. And in that final moment, Apollo remembered what mattered most. Along with the mother, the unborn child would perish too, his son, who still lived within her. The god could not allow that. He had failed to save his beloved, but he had to save the child. Through the flames already climbing toward the sky, Apollo reached out his hand and snatched the infant from the body of the dead mother, from the very heat of the funeral pyre. So, amid fire and death, a new life was born. The boy was named Asclepius, and his fate was marked from his first breath by both loss and wonder. He came into the world not from a mother's embrace, but from the hands of a god, torn out of the fire at the last instant. Apollo looked at the son he had saved from the flames, and everything was in that gaze. The guilt for his beloved's death, the tenderness toward the only thing left of her, and something more besides, a sense that this child would not be ordinary. The god could not take the infant to Olympus, because the world of the immortals is no place for a mortal boy to grow. He needed a mentor, wise and dependable, able to raise a god's child as that child deserved. And such a mentor existed. High in the mountains lived the one known as the greatest teacher of heroes, a wise centaur named Chiron. Half man, half horse, he was nothing like his wild and unruly kin. Chiron was renowned for knowledge that surpassed anything human, and fathers from all across Greece brought their sons to his cave so they might learn the arts of healing, music, hunting, and honor. It was to him that Apollo decided to entrust Asclepius. The god carried the infant into the mountains and gave him into the centaur's care. From that moment began an education destined to change what mortals believed possible. Chiron took in Apollo's child, not yet knowing that this boy would surpass even him. Because in the small Asclepius slept a gift the world of men had never seen. A gift that would later raise him to the heights of fame and at the same time lead him to destruction. And with him, his divine father, to a disgrace no Olympian had ever known. In the mountains, far from human bustle, the childhood of Asclepius passed. The centaur Chiron proved to be exactly the mentor the son of a god needed. He taught the boy to recognize herbs and roots, to understand the hidden properties of plants, to see in every blade of grass either medicine or poison. He revealed to him the secrets of the human body, showed him how to stop bleeding, how to knit a broken bone, how to drive fever out of a body. The boy listened hungrily, because an inborn pull toward healing lived in him. Very soon it became clear that this student would never be an ordinary physician. What others mastered over years, Asclepius grasped from the first word. He not only memorized Chiron's teaching, he added something new to it himself, saw connections that even the wise centaur had missed. In his hands, healing stopped being a craft and became an art, almost a wonder. The sick whom everyone else had given up on returned to life under his care. To this natural gift, so the stories say, another was added, entirely supernatural. The goddess Athena, who looked kindly on the young healer, passed him a rare treasure. It was the blood of the dreadful Gorgon Medusa, whose gaze had once turned the living to stone. That blood had a double nature. What flowed from the left side of the monster carried ruin and poison. What flowed from the right had the power to heal and even to give back a life that was lost. It was this saving gift that came into the hands of Asclepius. Armed with Chiron's knowledge, his own talent, and the mysterious power of that miraculous blood, Asclepius rose ever higher in his art. His fame spread through the lands of Greece. From everywhere, the sick, the crippled, and those tormented by illnesses that defeated all other healers came flocking to him. And he helped them, restored sight to the blind, set the paralyzed back on their feet, quenched the fevers that were cutting down whole families. People began to honor him almost as a god while he still lived. He taught his art to his own children and students, passing the knowledge on so the gift would not fade with him. From him, the Greeks believed, came whole generations of physicians, and his name grew sacred to everyone devoted to healing. Across the land, sanctuaries would rise in his honor, where the sick came hoping for recovery, and where, it was believed, Asclepius himself appeared to them in dreams with advice. But the higher his skill climbed, the closer he came to a line no mortal may cross. At first, he simply saved the hopeless. Then he learned to turn death aside as it was already reaching out its hand. And then came what was bound to happen to a man who held the Gorgon's blood and a talent without equal. Asclepius learned to bring back those who had already crossed the threshold of death. At first, this might have seemed only the highest expression of his gift. What harm is there in returning a man whose family weeps for him? What evil in a victory over sickness and even death? For people, it was the greatest blessing imaginable. At his door crowded not only the sick, but those who brought him the freshly dead, begging for the impossible. But in the world as the Greeks imagined it, there was a strict arrangement. Everyone is given his place and his time. To mortals belongs a short life, after which the soul descends into the gloomy realm of the dead, from which there is no return. To immortals belongs eternity on the shining heights. This line between the living and the dead, between people and gods, held the world in balance. Whoever erases it threatens the foundation of all that exists. Asclepius perhaps did not realize the weight of what he was doing. He was guided by mercy, by a wish to ease suffering, by love for people. But good intentions do not cancel consequences. Every dead man he returned was a challenge to the order on which the world stood. And although people blessed his name, with every resurrection, the shadow above him thickened, because down below, in the domain of the dead, it had been noticed that the flow of souls was thinning. The one to whom all the dead belonged began counting how many subjects this insolent healer was taking from him, and the displeasure of the lord of the underworld would soon rise to the very top, to the one whose word was law. Above his own head, without knowing it, Asclepius had raised a fate that would make his gift equal to his ruin. Deep beneath the earth, far from the sun, stretched a kingdom into which every mortal eventually descended. It was ruled by the grim brother of Zeus, lord of the departed, whose name the Greeks spoke reluctantly so as not to invite misfortune. Into his countless domains flowed an eternal river of souls that had left earthly life. That current had been unchanging since the beginning of time, and on it rested the balance between the living and the dead. But lately, something had gone wrong. The lord of the underworld, used to subjects arriving without pause, noticed a strange change. There were fewer souls. Those who by every law should have come down to him were staying above, among the living. At first it seemed like chance, but when the shortfall became obvious, he understood the cause. The guilty one was a mortal healer, brazenly tearing lawful spoils from his hands. Anger seized the grim god. This was no petty insult, but an attack on the foundation of his power. If a mortal can bring back the dead as he pleases, the line between life and death loses meaning. His kingdom will stand empty, and the order of the world will shake. He could not leave this unanswered. Yet he had no right to punish the offender himself, for that would be interference in the world above. So he carried his complaint to where the highest decisions were made. He turned to Zeus, ruler of gods and men, keeper of the world order. Before the Thunderer came the charge that the mortal Asclepius was violating an eternal law by bringing back from beyond those meant to remain dead. That complaint settled on the heart of Zeus as a heavy weight, because it touched not the whims of one god, but the foundation on which the whole world rested. Zeus considered it, and what he saw troubled him more deeply than any complaint. The problem was wider than a few returned corpses. If people learn to overcome death, if the line between mortal and immortal is erased, what will separate gods from men? The whole structure of the world, where some are granted eternity and others a brief span, loses its support. Today, Asclepius brings back one dead man. Tomorrow, people trained by him stop fearing death and rise to the level of gods. This thought decided the healer's fate. Zeus understood that his gift, however great a blessing it seemed, was a mortal threat to everything that exists. Healing individual patients could be tolerated, but when it came to overcoming death itself, to destroying the boundary on which the world stands, there could be no leniency. The ruler of the gods decided to end it once and for all, before something irreparable happened. Here it is worth pausing, because in this lies the deep truth of the tale. Asclepius was no villain. He sought no power, sowed no evil, destroyed no one. On the contrary, he saved people, gave them hope, gave fathers back to their children. Everything he did came from mercy. That is exactly why his story is so unsettling. It shows that even the highest good, taken to its extreme, can break the balance and invite ruin. This was the tragedy of his position. Not malice led him to destruction, but an excess of his own gift. He crossed the line not out of greed, but out of love for people. Yet the order of the world takes no account of intentions. It takes account only of consequences, and the consequence was that a mortal had begun to do work belonging to fate and the gods alone. For that, the reckoning had to be merciless. Zeus raised the hand that held the most terrible weapon in the world. It was the thunderbolt, forged for him by skilled craftsmen, the one force before which everything living and lifeless trembled. That bolt he intended for the mortal healer who had dared to argue with death itself. The sentence was passed, and the Lord of Thunder himself would carry it out. But while the storm gathered, no one knew that the strike would kill more than Asclepius. It would kindle in his father's heart a fury that would push the radiant Apollo into an act that changed the god's own destiny. The thunder about to fall on the healer was the first link in a chain, and at the end of that chain, the god of light was awaited by disgrace and bondage. The thunder struck when no one expected it. The sky blazed with blinding fire, and the bolt of Zeus fell straight onto Asclepius. He who had so often turned death from others could not turn it from himself. The greatest healer who ever lived fell dead, struck by the weapon of the ruler of the gods. So ended a life that had given life back to others. News of his son's death raced around the world and reached Apollo. In that moment, the radiant god, the embodiment of light and harmony, felt what only mortals had known. He felt the despair of a father who has lost a child. The pain that once pierced him above the pyre of Coronis returned, immeasurably stronger. He had lost his beloved. Now his son was taken too, the only thing left of her. Apollo's grief was not quiet. It was the rage of a divine power that finds no outlet. He knew whose hand had hurled the bolt. He knew that behind his son's death stood Zeus himself, Lord of Olympus, his own father. In this lay the hopelessness of his position. Against whom could a god broken by grief turn his fury? To raise a hand against Zeus meant challenging the force that had cast down the Titans. Apollo understood he was no match for his father. Zeus stood above him, and open rebellion would be suicide even for an immortal. Rage boiled in him, demanding retribution, but the direct road of vengeance was closed. And so, blinded by grief, the god chose another road. A crooked one, but one that would at least dull his fury. He could not punish Zeus, but he could punish those whose hands had made the murder weapon. The bolt that struck Asclepius had not appeared from nothing. It was forged by mighty beings of an ancient race who served the Thunderer. These were the Cyclopes, giants with a single eye in the middle of the forehead, unmatched smiths who had forged his thunders from the start of his reign. They had given the ruler of the gods the force that killed Asclepius. On them fell the anger of Apollo. If you cannot strike the one who hurled the bolt, you can destroy those who forged it. There was a dark logic in this, the logic of grief, hunting for someone to blame just to avoid feeling powerless. The radiant god, whose arrows carried unerring death, turned his bow against the ancient smiths. The Cyclopes, who served Zeus himself, died at the hand of his own son. This was an act of terrible weight. Apollo did not merely avenge his son. He raised his hand against those who served the highest god, against craftsmen whose work upheld the power of Zeus over the world. By destroying them, he struck at the instrument of the Thunderer's rule. It was a challenge disguised as revenge, a blow aimed not directly at his father, but at the foundation of his strength. In the heat of fury, Apollo surely did not grasp what he had dared. Grief had clouded his mind, and the thirst for retribution overcame the good judgment always counted among his virtues. The god of measure and order had himself broken measure. He who cleansed others of the stain of spilled blood had stained himself with the blood of the Cyclopes. In this lay the bitter irony of his fall. When the rage subsided, the full weight of it rose before him. He had challenged his father, even if not directly. He had destroyed the servants of the highest god. Now the anger of Zeus would inevitably fall on him, an anger from which there is no hiding at the furthest ends of the world. Vengeance for a son had become a new crime, and now the avenger himself would answer for it. Zeus did not leave his son's deed unanswered. His fury flared with new strength, because now he had been insolently wronged by the one he had fathered. A threat of punishment more terrible than anything Apollo could imagine hung over him. For such a crime, the highest god could cast the guilty into the darkest abyss of the world, a place from which there is no return. The radiant god, used to the summit, stood one step from the deepest fall. The anger of Zeus was terrible, and the punishment ripening in him matched the crime. Apollo had destroyed the faithful smiths of the Thunderer, and for such insolence the harshest sentence awaited. The ruler of the gods intended to cast his own son into Tartarus, into the bottomless darkness beneath the realm of the dead, where the fallen Titans were imprisoned. There, in eternal gloom, was to be shut away the one who had just shone above the world more brightly than anyone. Tartarus was a place more terrible even than the kingdom of the dead. Into it were thrown the most dangerous enemies of the gods, those who had to be locked away forever. For Apollo, god of light and freedom, such a fate would be unbearable, worse than any death. To be sealed in eternal darkness, cut off from the sun, from music, from everything he was, meant the end of himself. And this hung over him for the killing of the Cyclopes. But in this darkest moment, the one who gave him life stepped forward. Leto, his mother, came before Zeus with a plea. She reminded the thunderer of the son they shared, and that Apollo had acted not from malice, but in the frenzy of a father's grief. She begged him to soften the sentence, not to condemn the radiant god to eternal darkness. A mother's intercession did what no force could have done. The heart of Zeus grew a little gentler. The ruler of the gods weighed her words. He could not leave the crime unpunished, for that would undermine his own authority and the order of the world, nor did he wish to destroy his own son forever in Tartarus. And so Zeus reached a decision that joined severity with mercy. Apollo would not be cast into the abyss. Instead, another punishment awaited him, one that would strike not his body, but his pride. The sentence was unexpected and humiliating. The radiant god was to lose his divine majesty for a set term and enter the service of a mortal. He, before whom nations bowed, had to become a man's servant, carry out his will, work for him like a common hired hand. The god who steered the fates of kings was handed to the authority of a king, and a mortal one, who lived only a brief human span. In this lay the refinement of the punishment. Zeus could simply have imprisoned him, but instead chose what would hurt deeper. He decided to break not Apollo's power, but his arrogance. The highest deity was to learn on his own skin what it means to obey, to serve, to endure another's will in silence. He who stood immeasurably above all people had to sink to the position of a bondsman and live out his term. By some accounts, this term lasted 1 year. By others, it stretched to 8 long years, the so-called Great Year, which the ancient Greeks counted by exactly that number. However long it lasted, its essence was the same. The god of light had to give up his radiance, lay down his weapon, forget power and prophecy, and go to the house of a mortal master to serve him obediently and without a word. It is hard to grasp the depth of this humiliation for one used to universal worship. Only yesterday he had shone on Olympus beside his father. Only yesterday kings had caught every word of his oracle. Now he had to throw off his divine majesty like an unwanted garment and go where no one would honor him as a god, where he would be only a servant whose work a mortal master would judge. And yet a certain mercy hid in the sentence. Apollo remained alive. He was not imprisoned forever in Tartarus. The years of service would pass, and he would reclaim his former greatness. The punishment was heavy, but not eternal. It was meant to teach a proud god humility, to remind him that even above immortals stands a law that cannot be broken. In that lesson lay its true meaning. So the radiant Apollo, god of light, music, and prophecy, went into exile to serve a mortal. His road led to a land in Thessaly, to the palace of a king whose name would enter the old tales forever because of this extraordinary service. The god did not yet know that in that house more than humiliation awaited him. There he would meet a human kindness that would change his view of mortals forever. The road of exile brought Apollo to Thessaly, to a region where pastures spread along the banks of the quiet river Amphrysus, and numerous herds grazed. Here stood the palace of a king named Admetus, ruler of the city of Pherae, and he was destined to become the master of the radiant god. Before crossing that threshold, Apollo had to do what was harder for him than any physical torment. He had to strip away everything he was. The god took off the golden radiance that always surrounded him. He laid aside his bow, with which he could no longer punish mortals or immortals. He sealed within himself prophecy, music, the force of healing. Everything that made him Apollo now had to fall silent. Into the house of Admetus walked not a god before whom the world bowed, but an ordinary-looking hired man, ready to herd cattle at a mortal's command. It is hard to convey what one used to, standing above everyone, felt at the bottom. Only recently kings had trembled, awaiting the word of his oracle. Now he waited for the word of a king, and a mortal one, whose whole life in a god's eyes lasted a moment. Every order he received, every rough task, reminded him of his fall from the summit of the world into the position of a bondsman. The first days were a genuine trial of pride. He who had mastered an art that set the sky in order now drove cows to pasture and brought them back at dusk. He whose voice had sounded in the holiest temples now listened in silence to overseers. Hands that had held a golden lyre took up plain shepherd's work, and no one around him suspected whom this house had taken in. Yet something else hid in this humiliation, something he did not notice at first. For the first time in his immortal existence, he was among people not as a ruler, but as one of them. He lived their life, shared their labor, saw their cares up close, not from the height of Olympus, but shoulder to shoulder. This closeness to simple human existence would change him more deeply than he could have foreseen. Until then, Apollo had known mortals only as those who pray, bring offerings, and wait for the will of the gods. He had seen them from below, looking up, as supplicants at his altar. Now he looked at them from within. He came to know weariness after a long day, saw how shepherds rejoice at a good increase in the herd, how they grieve when animals are lost. The world of people opened to him as a living, warm, vulnerable reality. And still, his pride suffered. Every morning began with the same reminder of disgrace. He, the son of Zeus, woke not in radiant halls, but amid the smell of cattle and damp grass. The sun, to which he had so often been compared, now rose over him as over an ordinary hired hand who must drive the herd into the field. Such was the price of his crime, such was his father's will, and he could not change it. But fate had a surprise for him. The house he had come to was unlike others. King Admetus was a man of rare disposition, and his conduct turned a bitter punishment into something far more complicated than servitude. The way this mortal treated an unknown servant would ease the god's burden and plant in his heart a feeling rare between an immortal and a human being. Admetus was no cruel master who sees in a servant only working hands. He was famous through the region for fairness and hospitality. When a new shepherd appeared in his house, the king treated him not as a slave, but as a guest beneath his roof. That kindness, so simple and sincere, was bound to move even a god who only yesterday had been blinded by pride. Who was this mortal king who became the master of a radiant god? Where did such unusual gentleness in a ruler come from? And how would his kindness change the fate not only of himself, but of those he loved? Because it was the character of Admetus, his humanity and his flaws, that would set off a chain of events in which a god's gift had to be paid for with a life. Admetus, lord of Pherae, was unlike many kings of his time. Power had not made him arrogant. Wealth had not dried up his compassion. He ruled his land wisely and gently, and his subjects loved him sincerely, without the fear so often mistaken for respect. Above all, he was famous for hospitality, the sacred virtue the ancient Greeks honored as one of the highest. Hospitality for them was no mere politeness. They believed a god might enter a human home disguised as a traveler or a beggar to test the hearts of mortals. So, whoever knocked had to be received with respect, fed and sheltered, without being asked who he was or where he came from. Whoever broke this law called down the anger of heaven. Whoever honored it could hope for favor. Admetus lived by this law not from fear, but at the call of his heart. When a new shepherd appeared in his lands, a man of strange bearing and unclear origin, the king did not treat him with contempt. He took him under his roof, saw that he knew neither hunger nor insult, and treated him more like a respected helper than a servant in bondage. In this, the king's true nature showed itself. Apollo, who had prepared to endure humiliation, met respect instead. Day after day he saw that this mortal had no wish to degrade him, took no pleasure in power over a servant, demanded nothing beyond measure. Admetus was fair in every small thing, attentive to those who served him, generous to those who deserved it. And this unusual conduct slowly melted the ice in the proud god's heart. At first, Apollo surely did not believe him and waited for a trick. He knew people as weak creatures easily tempted by power. He assumed that as soon as a mortal feels strength over another, cruelty wakes in him. Yet day after day, Admetus disproved that by his behavior alone. His kindness was not a performance. It was a genuine feature of his nature. And in the god, something began to be born that he had barely known toward mortals. It was gratitude. Not the condescending favor gods sometimes granted their favorites from on high, but a warm, almost human thanks for good treatment. Apollo, used only to receiving worship, felt for the first time a wish to repay a mortal for his humanity. That wish would later pour out in gifts surpassing anything a human could imagine. So, a punishment conceived as humiliation was turning into something else. Zeus had wanted his son to learn humility, and learn it he did, but not through a master's harshness, through his kindness. The god was learning not to hate bondage, but to value the one who eased it. This was a subtler lesson than the Thunderer intended, a lesson that true greatness sometimes lies not in strength, but in kindness. The Greeks who passed this tale from mouth to mouth put a deep idea into it. They showed that even a god can be moved by human kindness, that the hospitality and fairness of a mortal can win the favor of heaven itself. In Admetus, they painted a model of what a person ought to be, and the reward for that model was the friendship of a god, a thing unheard of for an ordinary mortal. Yet this favor, so touching at first glance, carried a hidden danger. A god's love for a mortal rarely passed without consequence. Attached to Admetus, Apollo would want to shield him from every misfortune, even those no one has the power to turn aside. And when an immortal tries to change a mortal's fate, the balance of the world is again at risk, and for such interference, somebody always pays. For now the days of service passed peacefully, and under the hand of the shepherd god, something remarkable began in the household of Admetus. The king's herds multiplied as never before, and people marveled at the unheard-of abundance. No one knew the true reason. No one guessed whose care had blessed these pastures. And meanwhile, the time drew near when the god's gratitude would show itself in a deed that would shape the whole of the king's later life. What happened to the herds of Admetus during Apollo's service could not fail to astonish. The cows he pastured bore twins, one after another, and where a single calf had been born, now there were two. The flocks multiplied at an unheard-of pace. The ewes gave rich milk and healthy lambs. Abundance flowed into the royal house in an unbroken wave, and the pastures of Phaerae became the richest in the region. People saw this prosperity but could not grasp its cause. They credited it to good grazing, a mild winter, the favor of unknown powers. No one imagined that Apollo himself walked among them, a god who from ancient times had watched over herds and flocks. Among his other gifts, he had this one too, authority over cattle and pastures. And now that power, though hidden, blessed everything he touched. Within this prosperity lay Apollo's quiet answer to the king's kindness. The god could not openly reveal his nature, but he could repay the favor as he knew how. Every set of twins born, every healthy herd, was his silent thanks to Admetus for treating him as a human being. So bonds formed between god and mortal that the end of the service would not break. Apollo came to love this house and its master. Meanwhile, the service was changing the god himself. The days among people and animals showed him what he had never seen from Olympus. He understood how fragile human life is, how much simple joys and simple losses weigh for mortals. He learned to see in people not only supplicants at an altar, but living beings worthy of compassion. That experience made him not weaker, but in a certain sense, wiser. Perhaps it was then that his particular closeness to people arose, the closeness that set him apart from many gods. He became the patron not only of prophecy and music, but of the order on which human communities rest. They say he inspired the founders of cities, helped people raise walls and put their lives in order. And who knows whether his love for the human work of building did not begin in these days. So the term of his punishment ran on. Whether 1 year or the long, great year of 8, time was passing, and the moment approached when the god would be freed and reclaim his greatness. But before that, fate prepared a trial for Admetus in which, without a god's help, he had no hope. The king wished to marry, and the chosen one of his heart was no ordinary girl. He fell in love with Alcestis, daughter of the mighty king Peleus, ruler of Iolcus. Alcestis was famous not only for her beauty, but for the purity of her heart, and many suitors sought her hand. But her father was stern and cunning, and he had no intention of giving his daughter to just anyone. He devised a trial meant to sift out all but the worthy, a trial that at first glance seemed impossible. Peleus announced he would give Alcestis only to the man who achieved the unthinkable. The suitor had to harness 2 of the wildest beasts, a lion and a boar, to a single chariot and drive that team along an appointed route. The task was designed so that no mortal could complete it. For how can 2 predators be brought under one yoke when each would sooner tear a man apart than submit to him? Admetus, hearing the condition, fell into despair. No human strength was equal to it, and the dream of Alcestis seemed lost forever. But in his house there served one for whom nothing was impossible, even now. The god who owed the king a debt of kindness could not leave him in trouble. Apollo's affection was about to turn into a wonder that would win the king a bride and set off a chain in which joy would be woven with sorrow. When Admetus had lost hope, help came from one who had himself known what an impossible task means. Apollo, whose power even hidden surpassed anything earthly, undertook to help his master win the woman he loved. For him, lord over wild creatures, taming a lion and a boar was well within reach even as a servant. What for a mortal bordered on madness was for the god only an expression of his concealed might. The god tamed the 2 fiercest beasts as one tames obedient cattle. The lion, king of predators, and the boar, the very image of wild fury, yielded to his will and stood meekly in a single harness. Apollo yoked them to the chariot with his own hands, joining what cannot be joined, and brought this unheard-of team to Admetus. What the boldest suitors had puzzled over in vain was done quietly by the hand of a god. Admetus took this gift and set out for Iolcus, for the palace of the stern Peleus. The king's astonishment knew no limits when a chariot appeared before him drawn by a lion and a boar walking side by side like tamed oxen. No other spectacle could have proved so convincingly that the suitor deserved his reward. Peleus, cunning as he was, had to keep his word, because the impossible had happened before all the witnesses. So Admetus won the hand of Alcestis, and no doubt remained that fate itself, or rather a god's favor, was on his side. The young couple returned to Pheræ, where a wedding worthy of a king awaited them. Joy filled a house that only recently had been sunk in despair. It seemed nothing could darken the happiness of Admetus and Alcestis, united by an inexplicable wonder. Alcestis proved worthy of her happiness. She was not merely a beauty, but a woman of rare devotion and nobility. She loved Admetus with all her heart, and entered his house not as a cold princess, but as a faithful companion, ready to share everything with her husband. It is this devotion of hers, so pure and boundless, that would become the core of the whole tragedy, because the greatest love sometimes demands the greatest sacrifice. But for now, nothing but joy reigned. The wedding was celebrated, songs rang out, offerings were brought to the gods in thanks for a happy union. And in this happiness, in the whirl of festivities, Admetus made a mistake that seemed trivial, but concealed a deadly danger. Among countless rites, he skipped one that was exceptionally important. By custom, the bridegroom had to bring the proper offerings to all the gods who watched over marriage and family. Among them was Artemis, the sister of Apollo, a stern goddess who did not forgive being slighted. In the joyful bustle, Admetus forgot to honor her as he should. Perhaps he simply lost that right among 100 other matters. But the gods take no account of human forgetfulness when it comes to the honor due to them. Artemis felt the insult. She, a mighty goddess, had been passed over on a day when others were honored, and this slight kindled her anger. She was not among those who forgive human carelessness, and although Admetus had meant no harm, the consequences of his forgetfulness would fall on him with the full weight of divine displeasure. The joy of the wedding was about to turn to horror. When the newlyweds entered the marriage chamber, a chilling sight awaited them. Instead of a wedding bed, they were met by a nest of snakes writhing all over the room. The chamber that was to be a place of happiness had become a den of serpents, a silent and terrible sign that the goddess was angry. Terror seized Admetus, for he understood he had called down the punishment of heaven without knowing his offense. In that moment of despair, he had only one hope. The god who had come to his aid so many times was close at hand. Only Apollo could grasp the cause of the anger and find a way to appease his furious sister. Whether the goddess would show mercy, and what price forgiveness would cost, the king did not yet know. Once more he turned to his divine protector, unaware that the greatest gift and the greatest danger lay ahead. Apollo did not abandon his favorite this time either. Seeing the terror of Admetus and the sign of his sister's anger, the god understood the cause at once. He knew the nature of Artemis better than anyone, for she was his twin. He knew the snakes were no accident, but a direct answer from the goddess to the slight she had suffered on the wedding day. And he knew the only way her anger could be turned aside. The god explained where the fault lay. The king had omitted the offerings due to Artemis, and that forgetfulness had called down the punishment. Now, to atone, he had to honor the offended goddess at once as should have been done from the start. Only a sincere offering and proper reverence could calm her anger and bring peace back to the house. Apollo told him exactly how, and undertook to intercede with his sister. Admetus, trembling with fear, seized this hope with relief. He hurried to bring Artemis all the offerings due to her, to show the honor he had skipped in the whirl of the wedding, and to beg humbly for forgiveness. Beside him, Apollo pleaded for him, a god whose word weighed more with his sister than anyone else's. The brothers' effort and the mortal's repentance achieved what Admetus had no longer dared to hope for. Artemis showed mercy. Her anger died down, and she removed the dreadful serpents from the marriage chamber. What had been a nest of snakes became a place worthy of a young couple again. The danger passed, and the house of Admetus was calm once more. A second time the king saw how much the favor of the god living under his roof meant, because without that protection, his happiness could have turned to ruin in the first days of his marriage. This episode, though it ended well, reveals an important feature of the whole story. Again and again, Apollo intervened in his favorite's fate, turning every misfortune aside. First, he helped him win a bride. Now he saved him from a goddess's anger. The god was weaving his power ever more tightly into a mortal's life, shielding him from everything. In this lay sincere affection, but also a danger hard to notice at once, because every such intervention shifted the natural course of things. A mortal for whom a god intercedes begins to live differently than an ordinary person is meant to. The troubles that should have found him pass him by. The trials he ought to have withstood alone are solved by someone else's strength. And although for Admetus this was good fortune, such protection led quietly toward a line dangerous to cross, even with the best intentions. So far, Apollo had saved him from troubles that could be turned aside. Taming beasts, appeasing a goddess, all of this lay within the possible, even if it required divine power. But ahead lay a trial of a different kind, before which all gifts and all protection fall away. That trial was death itself, the inevitable end appointed to every mortal from birth. Here, a god's love for a human being was bound to collide with the highest law of the world. It is one thing to turn illness or a goddess's anger from a favorite, quite another to encroach on what fate has settled forever. Every person is measured out a span, and when the appointed hour comes, no one has the power to postpone it. So it had been, since the beginning of time, and so it was meant to be, always. But Apollo, blinded by affection, refused to accept that his favorite would one day die like all mortals. Once already he had been unable to accept his son's death, and that refusal had brought him disgrace and bondage. Now, with the shadow of the end looming over Admetus, the god again conceived a plan no one had dared attempt. He decided to outwit fate itself, and for that, he had to turn to those whose will not even the gods contradicted. Above everything that exists, above people and gods, above Zeus himself, stood a power older and more implacable than any authority. These were three sisters, the three fates, goddesses of destiny, who spun the thread of every life from birth to the final breath. The first spun that thread, the second measured its length, and the third cut it without pity when the appointed time came. Their verdict was final, and even the Olympians bowed before it. No one could change what the fates decreed. When they measured out a mortal span, that measure was unbreakable. The gods could grant a person victory or defeat, wealth or poverty, but no one could extend life beyond the appointed term. In this lay the foundation of the world order, the same boundary between mortal and immortal that Asclepius had tried to erase and had paid for with his life. Apollo knew all this better than anyone. He remembered how his son's attempt to get around the law of death had ended. He had learned in his own fate what awaits the one who challenges the order of the world. And still, his affection for Admetus proved stronger than caution. The god could not accept that his favorite would go down to the realm of the dead when his hour came. And he devised a daring plan to deceive the goddesses of destiny themselves. Since it was impossible to persuade the fates openly, Apollo resorted to cunning. He came to the three sisters not with a demand, but with gifts. He brought them wine, generous and sweet, and set about serving the goddesses as if to honor them. He only pretended to drink alongside them, while in truth he kept refilling their cups, making sure they never stood empty. And slowly, even the implacable fates yielded to the drink. When the goddesses of destiny had grown merry, their usual severity weakened. In that mellow, good-natured state, they became more yielding than ever. And then Apollo turned to them with his request. He begged the sisters to do for his favorite Admetus what they had done for no one. He asked that the king should not die at the hour appointed to him, that the thread of his life should not be cut when it was decreed. The fates, softened by wine and coaxing, agreed to a concession. Yet, even merry, they could not repeal their own law, for the death of Admetus was written into the order of things. So they set a condition, cunning and implacable even in its leniency. Admetus could escape death at the appointed time, but only if someone else agreed to die in his place, giving up his own life willingly instead. So the thread of the king's life was not simply lengthened. In its stead, another thread would be cut, the thread of whoever agreed to go down to the realm of the dead for him. The law of fate remained unbroken in its essence. Death was still to take its due at the appointed hour. All that changed was whom it would take. The fates did not abolish death. They only allowed one victim to be swapped for another. Apollo, elated by his success, took this promise as a great gift and hurried to his favorite. It seemed to him he had won something close to impossible, the power to escape death. In his joy at outwitting fate, the god surely did not think through the trap hidden in this present, because in the condition of the fates lurked a cruel blade, aimed not at the king, but at the one who loved him most. At first glance, it all looked like mercy. The king was given the chance not to die in his fatal hour. But if one thought deeper, it became clear the gift was terrible. Someone had to perish in his place, and so his rescue inevitably meant somebody's death. The god who wished to save one was condemning another. And once again, the same violation of measure appeared, the one that had already cost so much. Apollo, however, believed a substitute would be easy to find. Surely around the king there were people who loved him enough to give their lives. He had an aged father and mother who had already lived a long span. He had loyal subjects who honored their ruler. It seemed to the god that a willing person was bound to be found, and then his favorite would live on without truly losing anyone close. But the god was wrong, the way even immortals go wrong when they rely too much on human gratitude. Because when death knocked at the door of the royal house, it would turn out that the willingness to love in words and the willingness to die in fact are entirely different things. And the one soul that agreed to the sacrifice would not be the one anyone had counted on, but the one whose loss would cause Admetus the deepest pain. The years passed, and the life of Admetus and Alcestis flowed in a happiness that seemed endless. Apollo's term of service had long ended, and the god had reclaimed his greatness. He shone on Olympus again, wielded his bow, his music, and his prophecy again, and the shameful bondage was left behind like a heavy dream. But the gift he had left his favorite had not gone anywhere. The promise of the fates was waiting quietly at the foundation of the king's destiny. The king, meanwhile, lived without thinking much about his postponed death. He had a wife, children, and a flourishing kingdom, and the fatal hour seemed distant and unreal. But fate does not forget its accounts. And the day came when death itself arrived for the soul of Admetus, to take him at the appointed time. What had seemed only the words of merry goddesses turned into an implacable reality. And then the full cruelty of the gift that had looked like mercy was revealed. Admetus could escape destruction, but only if someone agreed to die in his place. The king, who had never thought hard about that condition, suddenly stood face to face with it. He had to find someone who would willingly descend into the realm of the dead to save him, and it turned out to be incomparably harder than it had once seemed to the god. First, he turned to those from whom he should have expected the greatest love, to his aged parents. He assumed a father or mother who had already lived a long span would gladly yield the remainder of their days to their son. How much was left to them, while a whole life still lay ahead of him? But the opposite happened. His old father flatly refused, answering that the modest life left to him was sweet all the same, and that death frightens even an old man. It was a bitter moment of clarity for Admetus. Those who gave him life did not want to give up their own for him. Their love, so obvious in words, drew back before the true face of death. And the king understood how little assurances of sacrifice weigh when it comes to the final line. Not one of his kin, not one of his loyal subjects stepped forward. Everyone clung to his own life, whatever it was. And then the one from whom it was least expected came forward. Alcestis, his faithful wife, who had once entered his house thanks to a god's wonder, declared that she would die in her husband's place. She did not hesitate, did not bargain with death, did not look for excuses. Her love proved greater than the fear of destruction, greater even than the love of parents for a son. A young woman full of life gave herself up so her beloved might live. In this act, the full depth of her soul was revealed. Alcestis knew she was leaving her children without a mother and the world without her presence. She knew what she was walking into, and still, she took that step with a clear mind. Her sacrifice became the highest expression of devotion imaginable. And here, the terrible truth about Apollo's gift showed itself. The god had wanted to save his favorite, but the price was the life of the purest soul in the house. The appointed day came, and Alcestis began to fade. Life slowly left her, while Admetus, saved by her sacrifice, remained alive and well. The house that had rejoiced at a wedding was filled with weeping. The king, for whose sake all this had been done, realized with horror at what price his rescue was bought. He kept his own life, but lost the one dearer to him than that life. The gift had become a curse, and the mercy a death. So an old truth this world already knew was confirmed again. Death cannot be cheated without consequence. An attempt to outwit fate does not cancel its verdict. It only shifts the burden onto someone else, most often someone innocent. Apollo, in saving Admetus, did not defeat death. He only redirected its blow. And that blow fell on the one whose only fault was that she loved too much. And yet an unexpected ray of light would fall across this gloomy story. Into the house of Admetus, in the days of mourning, would come a wandering hero of superhuman strength, a descendant of Zeus who was not in the habit of accepting death. Learning of the sacrifice of Alcestis, he would dare an act almost no one had dared. He would set out to meet death itself and tear the brave woman from its grasp. One might think the lesson learned in the house of Admetus was enough for Apollo to remember how his bold deeds end. But the fate of the god of light held one more humiliation, no less bitter. The service with Admetus was not the only time he had to lay down his greatness and work for a mortal. The second time he was brought into bondage by an old conspiracy on Olympus itself. They told that a plot against Zeus once ripened among the gods. Several mighty Olympians, unhappy with the Thunderer's rule, conspired to overthrow him. Among them, so the stories go, were the lord of the sea, Poseidon, and Apollo himself. They meant to subdue the ruler of the gods, but their design was uncovered, and the revolt failed. Zeus, learning of betrayal by those closest to him, did not leave it unpunished. The punishment was as humiliating as Apollo's earlier one for killing the Cyclopes. Poseidon and Apollo were to lose their divine might for a fixed term and serve a mortal like common hired hands. So, for a second time, the radiant god cast off his light and took up hard labor at a human command. This time, the master of the two gods was the ruler of a famous city on the coast, a king named Laomedon. That city was called Troy, and it was destined to become the setting of the most famous war of the ancient world. For now, it was a young kingdom, lacking reliable defense. The two gods, disguised as ordinary workmen, were charged with raising mighty walls that would make it impregnable. Poseidon took the main task, drawing majestic stonework out of the rock, while Apollo watched over the herds on the slopes of Mount Ida and guarded the city. The picture was striking. Two of the mightiest gods, the Lord of the seas and the God of light, laboring for a mortal king, raising a wall stone by stone. The same hands that stirred up storms and drew a golden bow now built another man's city for wages. Once more, divine pride bowed to human will. Laomedon had servants under his command that no other ruler could boast of. The gods worked conscientiously, for such was the will of Zeus. Day after day, mighty walls rose around Troy, promising the city an unheard-of strength. According to the tales, one mortal hero also joined the building, and precisely the stretch he raised remained the single vulnerable spot, while the rest, built by gods, was truly impregnable. So within the walls of the future stronghold, both strength and a hidden weakness were present from the start. When the term ran out and the work was finished, Troy stood surrounded by walls without equal. The city had a defense worthy of gods, because gods had built it. Laomedon should have rejoiced and paid his extraordinary workmen the promised reward. That was the condition for which they had labored. It seemed all that remained was an honest settlement, and everyone could part without ill will. But Laomedon proved a man of an entirely different nature than the noble Admetus. If the lord of Pherae was famous for kindness and fairness, the lord of Troy became famous for the opposite. He was arrogant, greedy, and treacherous, ready to break his word whenever it suited him. And when the time came to pay the gods for their labor, this base nature prevailed. So fate again brought Apollo together with a mortal king. But this time, betrayal awaited him instead of kindness. If the service with Admetus taught him to value human decency, the service with Laomedon would show him the other side of human nature, its capacity for meanness and ingratitude. And his reaction would be nothing like his affection for Admetus. Instead of gifts, the city was awaited by punishment. Because when the two gods came for their reward, the king met them not with gratitude, but with an insolent refusal. What he did next called down the anger of heaven on Troy and set off a chain that generations later would bring the glorious city to ruin. The betrayal of one man would be paid for with the destruction of a kingdom, and not even walls raised by gods would save it. When the work was finished and the gods came for payment, Laomedon showed his true face. Instead of settling honestly, he refused to pay. What is more, he met them with threats and insults, as if he and not they were the injured party. According to the tales, the furious ruler even threatened to sell them into slavery on distant islands and to brand them forever as disobedient bondsmen were branded. This was not simple stinginess. It was insolent disregard for a sacred law that required payment for work done and the keeping of a given word. Laomedon broke the agreement and seasoned his betrayal with humiliation and threats. He did not know, or did not wish to admit, whom he was dealing with, for the gods had hidden their nature under the look of ordinary workmen. But his insolence would fall on him with the full weight of divine anger. Apollo and Poseidon, having heard out the treacherous king, cast off their mortal appearance. The term of their punishment had run out, and they were gods once more in the fullness of their power, which meant they could answer the insult as immortals should. And their answer was terrible, because little inflames anger like the treachery of one you have served honestly. The betrayal did not go without immediate retribution. Poseidon, lord of the seas, sent a monstrous creature from the deep against the coast of Troy. The huge beast came out of the water and laid waste to the shoreline, seizing people and cattle, sowing terror among the inhabitants. The sea that should have fed the city became a source of ruin. And alongside this came another calamity, for Apollo too laid down his punishment, a god who held power over illness. Apollo sent a fierce plague upon Troy. The same god who had guarded this city from disease during his service now turned his power against it. An unseen sickness moved through the streets, cutting down the inhabitants without distinction. The gift that had protected the Trojans became a weapon against them, for such was the double nature of Apollo, equally able to grant health and to send illness. The city, so recently proud of its walls, was caught between two punishments. Troy suffered. The plague destroyed people from within, while the monster laid waste to everything outside. The mighty walls raised by gods could not protect against a calamity that came from the builders themselves. Laomedon, who had hoped to cheat the gods without consequence, watched his kingdom perishing before his eyes. The insolence of one ruler became the suffering of a whole people, and the people paid for the sin of their lord. In this lies one of the bitterest lessons of the story. The betrayal struck not only at Laomedon, the reckoning fell on everyone, on innocent inhabitants who had nothing to do with their king's treachery. So it often happens that the pride and dishonor of a ruler settle as a burden on those who trusted him. The people of Troy perished not for their own guilt, but for the guilt of the one who ruled them. And this was only the beginning. Driven to despair by the suffering of his city, Laomedon turned to the seers for a way to calm the anger of the gods. The answer was merciless. To stop the disaster, the king had to give his own daughter to the sea monster. Only the blood of a princess surrendered to the beast could turn ruin away from the city. So a betrayal that began with greed now demanded the most horrifying payment imaginable. Laomedon faced a terrible choice: either sacrifice his own child or watch an entire kingdom perish. In the end, pressed by the cries of his people, he submitted to the verdict of the oracle. His daughter, young Hesione, was led to the shore and chained to a rock, left at the mercy of the monster. An innocent girl was to die for her father's sin, one more victim of his treachery. But when it seemed her death was inevitable, there arrived on the coast of Troy one who was not in the habit of retreating before monsters. He was the greatest hero of his age, a descendant of Zeus himself, who wandered the world performing incredible feats. Fate brought him there at the very moment the princess waited for death beside the rock. and his meeting with the treacherous Laomedon would finally decide the fate of the city the gods had built. The hero who arrived on the shores of Troy was called Heracles, and there was no strength on earth equal to his. He was returning from his famous wanderings when he came upon a dreadful sight: young Hesione chained to a rock. Learning of the calamity that had struck the city and of the verdict condemning the princess, Heracles decided to intervene. He offered Laomedon to kill the beast and save his daughter, but not for nothing. For his feat, the hero demanded a special reward: the divine horses that were the pride of the Trojan house. These were extraordinary animals, a gift from Zeus himself to the ancestors of Laomedon, received in exchange for a beautiful youth of the Trojan line whom the gods had carried off. These horses Heracles demanded for saving Hesione. Laomedon, pressed by disaster, agreed readily, if only to save his daughter. The bargain was struck. Heracles kept his word. He went out against the creature of the sea, and in a hard struggle overcame it, freeing Hesione from a terrible death. The city breathed with relief, for one of the two punishments was lifted. It seemed the king would now gladly give the hero his promised reward, as an honest man should. But Laomedon remained true to himself. For the second time in a short span, he broke his word, cheating not gods, but a hero. The king refused to hand over the horses. The same greed and treachery that had pushed him to deceive the gods now pushed him to deceive his rescuer. He probably assumed that, as before, he would go unpunished. But this time, he had miscalculated fatally. The cheated hero was not among those who forgive betrayal. Heracles swallowed his anger and left, but he left only in order to return and take his revenge in full. Time passed, and Heracles came back to Troy no longer alone. He arrived with an army, at the head of a company of brave warriors, to punish the treacherous king. The city, for all its mighty walls, did not hold out against his assault. Troy was taken, and Heracles carried out his revenge on the man who had cheated him twice. Laomedon perished, and with him fell almost all of his sons. The treacherous king paid in full. Almost all his sons perished, but one survived. Among the captives was the king's youngest son and his sister Hesione, the very woman Heracles had once saved, ransomed her brother by giving up her precious jewel for him. Thanks to that ransom, the young man remained alive, and from then on he was called by a new name that recalled the ransom. This surviving son was Priam, destined to become the last king of Troy. And here, the full scale of the disaster sown by Laomedon begins to come clear. Priam, the son of a traitor, became ruler of the rebuilt Troy and reigned for many long years. It was under his rule that the most famous of all wars would unfold, the war that would glorify and destroy this city forever. Troy, which the gods had built and then cursed, was doomed long before that war broke out. The seed of ruin was sown in the days of his father. In this lies the deep connectedness of events the ancient storytellers loved. The great war that destroyed Troy was no accident or the result of a single quarrel. It was the final link in a long chain that began with a betrayal of the gods. The insult dealt to Apollo and Poseidon was not forgotten. The anger of the Lord of the Sea against a city that never paid its debt did not fade, but smoldered, until it flared again in the last war. So the second bondage of Apollo, his labor on the walls of Troy, left a deep mark on the history of the world. The city he helped to build, and whose destruction he hastened, became the center of events that shaped the destinies of countless heroes and kingdoms. The walls the god of light had laid would outlive both their treacherous patron and his son, but in the end they would fall. because the curse laid on the city could not be turned aside by any walls. And although in that final war Apollo himself more than once defended Troy, the fate of the city was already decided. The god who had built these walls in bondage and later sent a plague against them could not save a doomed city. In this lay another bitter truth. Not even a god can cancel the consequences of an old sin once it is loose in the world. One great question remained. What did this whole story of humiliation and reckoning leave in the soul of the god who twice was a slave? Both periods of bondage passed, and Apollo long ago regained the fullness of his divine power. He shone on Olympus again, his oracle spoke again at Delphi, his lyre sounded again in the halls of the gods. Outwardly, it was as if those humiliating years had never existed. But one who has passed through slavery cannot remain entirely as he was. The experience of bondage quietly changed the god of light himself. Before his hardships, Apollo had seen mortals from above, as beings of a lower kind, fit for little more than praying and bringing offerings. He knew their pleas, but not their lives from within. The service with Admetus first set him shoulder to shoulder with people, made him share their labor, see their joys and troubles up close. The god who herded another man's flocks came to know what no other Olympian knew: the real taste of human existence. Perhaps from here arose his particular closeness to human affairs, which set him apart from many gods. He was honored not only as a distant heavenly light, but as the patron of thoroughly earthly work. He watched over herds and shepherds because he had been a shepherd himself. He inspired the founders of cities and their builders because he had built the walls of Troy. The labor he performed in bondage left a trace in his very nature. Bondage taught him something else no summit of power could have given. It showed him what it means to obey, to endure another's will, to be powerless before circumstances. One who has lived through humiliation looks differently at the humiliated. Perhaps that is why Apollo remained the god to whom those stained by guilt turned for cleansing and forgiveness. He knew what guilt and reckoning are, not by hearsay, but from his own bitter experience. There was, in that experience, a stern lesson about the limits of his own power. Twice, Apollo tried to shield those he loved from the implacable law of death. The first time, he could not accept his son's destruction and brought bondage upon himself. The second time, he deceived the fates for Admetus, and the rescue of his favorite cost the innocent Alcestis her life. Both times, he learned that even his might has a boundary that cannot be crossed without a terrible price. The Greeks, composing these tales, put into them an idea striking in its boldness. They showed that even gods are subject to a higher law, that even the strongest can fall, go wrong, suffer. Their Apollo was no unreachable idol without a flaw. He loved, raged, erred, and paid for his mistakes as mortals pay, only on an immeasurably greater scale. And this nearness to human imperfection made him understandable and alive. In the figure of a god who twice was a slave lies a deep truth about the nature of greatness. Because true greatness, as this story shows, is not in never falling. It is in carrying a lesson out of the fall and rising wiser. Apollo did not lose his divinity through bondage. On the contrary, he returned from it a god who understood both strength and helplessness, both power and submission. One might say the punishment Zeus conceived as humiliation, in the end, made his son more complete. The god of light, who had known only the brilliance of the heights, came to know the darkness of a fall as well. And precisely this combination made him the many-sided deity he was remembered as. In him were joined the majesty of the heavens and the experience of earthly hardship. And this doubleness gave his image a particular depth. So the story of Apollo the slave is more than a tale about the humiliation of a god. It is an account of how even the highest being grows up through suffering, of how a fall is able not to break, but to temper. And in this sense, the fate of the god echoes the fate of every human being, who also has to fall, to lose, to make mistakes, and to rise again. Because it is in this, not in unchanging brilliance, that the ancients saw true wisdom. It remains only to draw together the threads of this story and ask what it says to us, people living thousands of years after offerings ceased on the altars of Apollo. Because behind all the wonders, monsters, and gods in this tale hide questions that concern every one of us, and it is to them that we now turn at the last. At the very beginning, we posed several large questions, and now it is time to return to them, armed with everything we have learned. The first sounded like this. What could force an immortal god to bow his head? What could bring to his knees the one who stood above everyone? Now, the answer is clear. Above the gods themselves rises something greater than any power, an unbreakable law of the world order to which even the Olympians are subject. Apollo fell not because his might was insufficient. He fell because he crossed a line no one is permitted to cross. First, his son encroached on the power of death itself by bringing back the dead. Then the god raised his hand against the servants of Zeus, and each time the reckoning came without fail. Because the world rests on a balance that cannot be broken without consequence, whoever you may be. In this lies the first lesson. The second question was more personal. Have you ever paid a high price for somebody else's pride, for decisions made without your consent? This whole tale is full of those who paid exactly that way. The innocent Alcestis gave her life for a god's wish to shield Admetus. A whole people of Troy perished from plague and monster because of their king's greed. Again and again, the weight of other people's deeds settled on those who had nothing to do with them. And in this lies a bitter but important truth about our world. Very often, the consequences of someone's pride, greed, or mistake are paid for not by the one who committed them, but by those who happened to be nearby. The strong make decisions, and the price is frequently paid by the weak and the innocent. Recognizing this should not embitter us, but it should make us more attentive to how our own actions echo in the lives of others. The third question touched the very core of this story. Where does the line run that must not be crossed, even when the heart demands the opposite? Everyone in this tale who crossed it did so not out of malice. Asclepius brought back the dead out of mercy. Apollo saved his son and his favorite out of love. Their intentions were pure, yet the consequences were ruinous. In this lies the subtlest teaching of the whole account, because it teaches that good intentions do not repeal the laws of the world. Love, taken so far that it encroaches on death itself, turns not into rescue, but into new suffering. In trying to shield those close to us from the inevitable, we sometimes cause more pain than the loss itself. The wisdom these tales passed on lay in the ability to accept the limits set for a human being, without trying to break by force what cannot be broken. Yet, it would be a mistake to take only gloom from this story. Alongside the falls and the reckonings, bright things shine in it that deserve no less attention. There is the kindness of King Admetus, who honored a servant and earned the friendship of a god. There is the boundless devotion of Alcestis, ready to die for the man she loved. There is the humanity that moved even a proud god. In the darkest of tales, the ancients always left room for human nobility. And perhaps the most important thing this story says concerns the very nature of falling. Apollo, who twice was a slave, did not remain broken. Out of his hardships, he carried not bitterness, but a deeper understanding of the world and of people. His humiliation made him not smaller, but, in a certain sense, larger, closer, wiser. And in this lies a hope that concerns everyone. A fall does not necessarily destroy us. Sometimes it is precisely what shapes us. Because every one of us gets his own hardships, his own losses, his own moments of helplessness when we must submit to what cannot be changed. And the question is not whether these trials will find us, because they are inevitable. The question is who we will be when we come out of them, broken or tempered, embittered or wiser. The fate of a god who herded another man's flocks suggests that even the deepest fall can be turned into a step upward. Such is the story of Apollo the slave, a god who knew both the summit and the very bottom, and returned from that road more complete than he had been. It reminds us that above every power stands a law, that somebody else's pride is often paid for by the innocent, that love must know its limits, and that a fall is not a sentence, but a trial. And if this ancient tale has made you look even for a moment differently at your own falls and risings, then the voice of Apollo still speaks to us across the millennia.